Ah, so it's such a delight to be here. I walked in the back and felt the field here and came up from DC. I've been reading the newspaper too much, and you are a refuge. So thank you for coming. One of the things I've been thinking about so much, and I can feel it here, is we're shining a light on the power of meditation. And so there's these currents going on where there's just all this polarization and oppression and violence and news that can be so painful. And at the same time, never in the history of the world have so many people been consciously dedicating to waking up their hearts and minds. It's amazing. And I'll share with you that I and a couple of others are teaching at the Senate now on Capitol Hill, and we did last year and we're doing it this year. I don't know what kind of a difference anything makes anymore. I did see a great picture of some monks that were on the National Mall, and one of them saying, the lead monk is saying, "What do we want? Mindfulness. When do we want it? Now!" So we'll see. So some of the ways that I think of it, and I simplify it for myself, these kind of the forces of fear and those of awakening really are that we're watching the brain, and we're watching how sometimes there's really the dominance of the survival brain, and it takes hold in our own bodies and minds and in societies. And we also see the currents of where the brain is waking up in an integrated way, and you can see the more recently evolved brain in action, letting ourselves be touched by what matters, reaching out and caring because others are a part of our heart. So you see those forces, and I heard one story a mother told of trying to teach her children a little bit about this open-heartedness. And so she says, they're arguing over who's going to she's making pancakes. They're arguing over who gets them first. So she thought this is a time to teach them a lesson about compassion and generosity. And so she said, if Jesus was sitting here, he'd say, "Let my brother have the first pancake. I can wait." So the older one said to the younger one, "Okay, Ryan, you can have the first chance at playing Jesus." So as we know, the very grounds of awakening our hearts are to be able to pause and come into the present moment. And we so quickly tumble into what's next. Like we could be listening to me and kind of ready to move into whatever's next that I'm going to say. So I want to invite a collective pause, if it's okay, and just take a moment. I can see, just as I say the words, you start collecting yourselves. Take a moment to come into stillness in a way that feels comfortable. And close your eyes, if you will. And just notice in these moments what you're most aware of. What's your body like? Are you aware of your breath? The state of your heart, what mood is here? Perhaps noticing how even a moment in pausing actually allows for a radical shift. There's a sense of presence. There's a poet, Martha Postlewaite, and she says, "Do not try to save the whole world or do anything grandiose. Instead, create a clearing in the dense forest of your life and wait there patiently until the song that is your life falls into your own cupped hands and you recognize and greet it. Only then will you know how to give yourself to this world so worthy of rescue. Do not try to save the whole world or do anything grandiose. Instead, create a clearing in the dense forest of your life. create a clearing in the dense forest of your life. So opening your eyes when you'd like to. So we're going to explore together, and I'm actually going to invite you to practice some what it means to wake up out of a kind of trance of blame and separation. I think of our larger society and how much at odds so many are with each other, and how hearts get closed down. And what if each of us here is able to do a little bit more of disarming? And how does that ripple out? And I thought I'd start by sharing a story that touched me so much when I first heard it. And it's about a man I admire a whole lot, Jarvis Masters, who's a inmate at St. Quentin. And he's been there for a long time on death row. And he's written a book, and in it he tells a story about in the prison yard. It's on a winter day. There's a puddle of water, and a seagull landed in it. And one of the inmates, some young inmate, lifted a rock to throw it at the seagull. And Jarvis had taken vows of compassion, and his instinctive thing was to have him stop, And the inmate then got really upset, like, what you messing with me? And it's dangerous to mess with other people on the courtyard, so everybody got quiet to see what was going to happen. And so Jarvis looked at him and said, "That bird's got my wings. That bird's got my wings." And the other guy kind of put the stone down and looked at him puzzled, but that was the end. But for the next week or so, people come up to him, other inmates, and say, "What'd you mean by that, Jarvis?" And I think that we intuitively know what he meant. And that it's really the understanding that underlies the whole path of compassion, which is that each of us, every being, has vulnerability, and every being has sentience. And when we can remember, when we can slow down and quiet down enough to get, that bird's got my wings, then that being's a part of us. We don't want to act in a hurtful way. We want to be helpful. So, to me, one of the main things that we watch in ourselves is how quickly we forget. We get stressed, and the more stressed we are, the more others become, kind of objects out there, and we forget their realness. We forget who's there. So the trainings in compassion, and there are very explicit trainings, are to pay closer attention to each other. Now, another one of my kind of idols, Ruby Sales, who's a civil rights activist, and she's a theologian and so on. And she describes a turning point in her career as an activist. And I felt like this was so important. She describes being at a hairdresser, and the hairdresser's daughter came in, and she came in after a long night on the streets. And this is a woman who had been traumatized by sexual abuse and had kept it inside. She didn't even let her own mother know. And Ruby looked at her, and something in her told her to say this. She said, "Where does it hurt? Tell me, where does it hurt?" And all that pent-up pain began to pour out. And she told Ruby things that, as I said, that her mother didn't even know. And in that process, Ruby realized she needed a deeper, more powerful way to do her work, which included how to look at others so we can really get to who's really there and how are they hurting. And by the way, I heard this story in an interview Ruby had with Krista Tippett, and she goes on to describe, and this is like right when we were just so much was coming out about the violence against especially African American men on the streets. And Ruby was talking about really the suffering, the spiritual pain of white Americans. and the feelings of meaninglessness and so on, like seeing past the idea of a bad other. So this is the key to really awakening compassion towards ourselves and each other, is can we see the vulnerability? I mean, with our child, can we say, well, where does it hurt? Or a friend, or somebody who we're in argument with, or a politician we think is causing harm? Can we see past the mask? You know, one of the metaphors that I've loved for this are stories. If you imagine that you're on a walk and you see a dog, and the dog is a little dog by a tree, and you go over to pet it, but the dog lurches at you and its fangs are bared, and and you go from wanting to pet the dog to saying, oh my God, that's a bad dog, aggressive, and so on. But then you notice that the dog's leg is in a trap. And then you go from bad dog to, oh, you poor thing. Now, you don't necessarily get close so you can get bitten, but your heart shifts. Does that make sense? That leg in the trap? Well, I think of it like, what if as a society we could see whose leg's in a trap, who's hurting? You know, whether it's seeing those who are most vulnerable, I mean, those who have been marginalized and really have the dominant cultures oppressing and the injustice, where does it hurt? Can we see it in the perpetrators? And can we see it when we have created separation with somebody in our own circle? Can we see that? So it takes a conscious cultivation of attention, because what we do in our habitual mind state is we create what I call an unreal other. When we're stressed, it's like we're the protagonist in the world and everybody else there is a player in the field, and they are either in some way have something we want. We have an agenda. I want your money or your time or your energy or your approval. They're an unreal other in that way. Are there an unreal other because we're afraid of them in some way we're going to get judged? Are they not cooperating with our agenda in some way and they're getting in the way? They're hurtful in some way. Or they're just not important to us. One of my favorite little examples of that one is a guy hears a knock on the door, and he opens the door and there's a snail there. So he picks up the snail and he throws it as far as he can, closes the door. 3 years later, he hears another knock at the door. He opens the door, snail's there, and the snail says, "What the heck was that all about?" That's unreal othering. It's one example. I mean, another real common one is what we call traffic. It's like everybody else is traffic, but we're not. Do you know what I mean? So the first step in waking up compassion, if you want to leave here and have a little more dedication to that awakened heart, is to know that it starts with mindfulness. For compassion to be really fully blooming, it requires that we're aware of what's happening, like able to see and contact without judgment what's happening. That means that we start recognizing, oh, I'm blaming, I'm cut off. The poet Rumi says, your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you've built against it. So we become mindful, oh, I'm creating separation. And you might be scanning your life right now and just sensing, well, where have you created separation? Now, the Rumi quote actually has another piece to it. And I didn't learn about this until about 3 years ago, because I've been sharing this quote a lot. And that other piece is this, that you find the barriers and you embrace them. In other words, we don't judge ourselves for pushing others away, but we actually bring kindness to that too. I'm going to give you some examples, and I'm actually going to ask you to choose somewhere that you feel you're caught in blaming, and see if, just to explore waking up around that. One of the things that I find useful in thinking about this is a circle. And this is Joseph Campbell. He describes awareness as this big circle, and he says there's a line going through it, and everything we're not aware of is below the line. Everything we're aware of is above the line. When we're blaming, we're living in a smaller sense of who we are. We're in a kind of a victimized self, or an offended self, or a superior self. We're below the line some. And when we start recognize the blaming and practicing to wake up out of it, we come above the line. Now there's two main ways we go below the line with blaming. And it's a trance. And either we're blaming ourselves, like something's wrong with me, or we're in some way at odds with others. Now, the trance of unworthiness is something that I found is really pervasive. Well, let me ask you this. How many people here feel like you do judge yourself too much? Can I just see by hands? Okay, me too. All right, so we know we judge ourselves too much, but what we're not aware of is how pervasive that judging is and how much it affects most interactions, that in some way we're measuring ourselves against these ideas of how we should be and not spontaneous. I mean, it's interesting to notice an interaction and really sense how much of what I'm doing is to have the other person consider me in a certain way, to approve of me in a certain way. And usually when we have a standard, we feel we're falling short of it. It's like that classic, dog's on a psychiatrist's couch and he's saying, it's always good dog this and good dog that, but is it ever great dog? So we have these standards. Most of us go around with these internalized standards about how we should be, how we should look physically, how our personality should be, what kind of mind we should have, how we should perform, and they're very much, they're really internalized from our culture. It's like we're not thinking our own thoughts. We're thinking society's thoughts. We're programmed some. So we have ways we think we should look good and be acting. One young physician described just when he was newly graduated MD in obstetrics and how totally embarrassed he was doing a pelvic exam, and yet doctors are supposed to be authorities and confident. So to kind of deal with his embarrassment, he took to whistling while he was doing his exam. And so he was doing this, one middle-aged woman started laughing, and he was embarrassed. He said, "Oh gosh, am I tickling you?" or whatever it was. And then she had tears running down her cheeks. She said, "No, but the song you were whistling was, 'I wish I were an Oscar Mayer wiener.'" So we have different ways of kind of trying to cover for things, but we're under the line. It's like this is a trance still in some way. So in a deep way, just to give you a sense, one woman I was working with described her mother when she was dying, and she came out of a coma, and she looked her in the eye, and she said, all my life I thought something was wrong with me. And those were her last words. I mean, after that she died, but for my friend, it was an incredible gift in a way, because we don't realize how it's our habit to think something's wrong with us, and how much unnecessary suffering, like how much it blocks intimacy and creativity. And just to get a glimpse of what the Zen masters teach, they say to be without anxiety about imperfection. Just to imagine that for a moment, what would it be like to be without anxiety about imperfection? So we have this turning on ourselves, and I think for me, sometimes the most fundamental truths are the ones we forget, which are we can't be happy or intimate with others if we're turned on ourselves. That's one piece. And then we turn on others. And there's not only something wrong with me, there's something wrong with you. And it's usually because you in some way disagree with me or aren't cooperating. It's like one story, a little girl asked her father about how the human race appeared, and his response was, well, God made Adam and Eve. And no, she asked her mother first. Her mother said, God made Adam and Eve, they had children, all mankind was made. Then she asked the same question of her father, and her father said, well, many years ago there were monkeys from which the human race evolved. And she's confused. She goes back to her mother and said, you said that we're created by God, and Dad said from monkeys, what gives? And the mother said, it's very simple, dear. He told you about his side of the family, and I told you about mine. So I think every one of us creates unreal others where the other person's bad in some way and pushes them away. And the stronger we do it, the more armoring there is. And it's not like we can selectively make some people wrong and bad, close our hearts, but then turn around and all of a sudden feel this open-heartedness. So for an initial inquiry for you, I'd like to invite you to bring to mind somebody that you're holding blame or anger against. And if it helps to close your eyes, I know for me, I have to do that. Just to sense somebody that you'd like to explore a little more what's going on. We hold tight to it, to the blame or anger. So you might sense, even as you bring it up, that it's not going to be so easy to dislodge. And the question I'd like to ask you is, what would you have to feel that's difficult if you let go of the narrative of you're wrong or you're bad? What would you have to feel that's difficult? What would you get in touch with? You can continue to consider that, and let me just ask you, when you reflect on that, how many of you, when you think about that, if you put down that narrative, then in some way you might have to get in touch with, well, maybe something's wrong inside me. Let me just see by hands. I'm going to ask a few questions. Don't be shy. How many feel like then you'd be powerless? You'd lose some power. How many feel like if you did that, you'd have to face a lot of vulnerability or fear? Can I see by hands? Yeah. Usually, underneath our blame, there's vulnerability. We'd let go of it if it was easy to feel. And you can see this in the larger society, that there's, like Toni Morrison says, that American means being white. Everyone else has to hyphenate. What is it in us that needs to keep hating or demeaning the non-dominant groups? And then you think, well, we're no longer majority Christian anymore, so that creates some insecurity for some. And in 2045, we're not going to be majority white. There's a lot of fear, and that means aggression, trying to preserve privilege, power, status. This is James Baldwin. He said, I imagine that one of the reasons that people cling to their hate and prejudice so stubbornly is because they sense that once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with their own pain. Now, I'm bringing this up because as we've explored in some of the past conversations here, compassion isn't possible unless we're willing to feel what we really feel. We have to get in there and really contact what's there. But the given is it's going to be uncomfortable, the thing is that if we avoid the discomfort and hold on to the blame, we're cutting off from our own hearts. We're cutting off from our own full awareness. And one of the great, to me, the elegant teachings of the Buddha was, we suffer because we forget who we really are. We get narrowed into a sense of the victimized self or the defended self or the fearful self, but we forget who we are. And I sometimes think of this story of a young girl in a classroom doing a picture, and the art teacher stands behind her and asks her what she's drawing. And she says, well, I'm drawing God. And the teacher kind of chuckles, said, honey, nobody knows what God looks like. And she said, this is without skipping a beat, without even looking up. They will in a moment, you know. We lose touch with the awareness and love that's here because we get narrowed when we're living in judgment and blame. So what's the practice? Let's just look a little more at the practice for waking up out of the trance of blame. And I use an acronym that I find really helpful that's an acronym of mindfulness and compassion. And the acronym is RAIN, R-A-I-N. And I'm curious, how many here have heard of this acronym? Oh good. For those that haven't, R, and there's a few versions. R is recognize. And that means, recognize, I'm blaming, I'm judging. A is allow, and what that means is you don't try to get rid of it. You just make space. You create a clearing in the dense forest of your life. It's kind of like pausing. So you recognize what's going on, you allow it, make some space. The I, investigate, means that you're willing to contact what's there. Okay, what's really going on here? Feeling it. And then the N, nurture, bring kindness to what's there. And that loosens the identification, because if you rest after that, you'll sense there's a lot more presence and space and kindness for how we move forward. So let me give you an example of how this works. And we're getting closer to when I want to have you practice it, okay? So in one woman was in major conflict with her daughter, feeling a tremendous amount of anger and blame. Her daughter was a senior in high school, smoking a lot of marijuana. Her grades were down. And so this divide kept opening up wider and wider, because the more her mother was angry and blaming, the more the daughter shut down and withdrew. I don't know if any of you have ever had anything. I know that one. So we started working with it, and the recognize was angry at my daughter, and I'm also angry at myself for, what's going on. And the allow, okay, let it be there. Now investigate is that beautiful question, where does it hurt? And we start inner. When you investigate, you start with yourself. Don't skip to trying to have compassion for someone else. It's premature compassion. It won't be embodied. It won't have power. You first bring the attention inward. So you've recognized and allowed, okay, she's angry, she's blaming. Where does it hurt? And she could feel inside herself this fear that her daughter's life was going to get ruined, and then really this shame that she was not being a good parent, and this belief that I'm failing, and I'm failing at the thing that most matters to me. Okay, this is the recognizing. And it can lead to an ouch feeling. When you really investigate and get in touch, there's an ouch. It's a tolerable ouch, if you're very present, though. So she felt that ouch. It's kind of a soul sadness, actually, because she sensed how much she had been moving through life, feeling like in some way she was failing. She was falling short. So she's recognizing and allowing it, investigating it, feeling that ouch. And the nurture is just what I'm doing now. That, as you explored earlier, can be so powerful. For her, it was putting her hands on her heart. And often with nurture, there's many different ways, and I'll name a few. But often it's just offering the words that are going to be most healing in that moment. And by the way, you don't have to use your hands on your heart. There are many different ways of nurturing an inner state. But she found that the more she did that, the more she got stuck and recognized and allowed and investigated and brought kindness. And for her, it was, I'm sorry and I love you. That message to herself. I'm sorry and I love you. Then after that, she'd feel this shift. And she was more resting as in that kind of compassionate awareness than she was the angry mother or the victimized mother. In other words, her identity, her sense of identity had shifted. That is the core of transformation. When you go from this narrative about successful person, person that's got this kind of personality, fearful person, failing person, to just that space of tenderness, of wakefulness, of mindful awareness. And from that space, from that shifted identity, that enlarged beingness, it's really beingness, she could then look at her daughter and ask the question, where does it hurt? That's when she could do it. And when she did that, she could see senior in high school, afraid of what's coming next, trying to run away from her fears, but, just acting out. And she could begin with her daughter to communicate from a place of presence that wasn't going to make her defensive. Where does it hurt? It's such an important inquiry. I think each of us know that if we're living inside judgment towards another person, or if we lash out or speak out of it, what happens? And it just creates more distance, more cycles of violence. It's like one very wise saying that I've heard, vengeance is a lazy form of grief. Vengeance is a lazy form of grief, that when we've been hurt, hurting back ends up creating more suffering. We never heal. But if we can be hurt and recognize and allow and investigate, nurture, sense who we are beyond the hurt person, then we can take the next steps in our life in a creative way. So we call on this, and it's really the wings of mindfulness and compassion. This is, when you hear the words RAIN, it's not another strategy, it's just a way of bringing mindfulness and compassion to where there's distance, or where there's conflict, or where there's difficult emotions. And always start with the inner, and then widen the circles. Never skip over the inner. And know that when we're blaming or judging, truly we're in trance. We're under the line. We're not seeing all that's there. So I'm going to share one story that, for me, deeply motivated me in this area, and about waking up from trance. And it was told by I grew up Unitarian, and it was told by a Unitarian minister. She describes it Sunday, Christmas. Our family had spent the holidays in San Francisco with my husband's parents, but to get back to work, we had to drive 400 miles to Los Angeles on Christmas Day. We stopped for lunch in King City, and we walked into a diner. It was one of those that everybody was silent and quiet. There wasn't much going on. I sat Eric, our one-year-old, in a high chair and looked around the room and wondered, what am I doing in this place? No sense of really the holidays. And my reverie was interrupted when I heard Eric squeal with glee. Hi there. 2 words he thought were one. Hi there. He pounded his fat baby hands, whack, whack, on the metal high chair tray. His face was alive with excitement. Eyes wide, gums bared in a toothless grin. He wriggled and chirped, and I saw the source of his merriment, and my eyes couldn't take it in all at once. A tattered rag of a coat obviously bought by someone eons ago, both they and the zipper half-mast over a spindly body, toes that poked out of would-be shoes, a shirt that had ring around the collar all over, and a face Gums as bare as Eric's, hair uncombed, whiskers too short to be called a beard, but way beyond a shadow, a nose so varicose it looked like a map of New York. I was too far away to smell him, but I knew he smelled, and his hands were waving in the air, flapping on loose wrists. Hi there, baby. Hi there, big boy. I see you, Buster. My husband and I exchanged a look that was a cross between what do we do and poor devil. Eric continued to laugh and answer hi there. Every call was echoed. I noticed waitresses' eyebrows shoot to their foreheads. Several people hummed out loud. This old geezer was creating a nuisance with my beautiful baby. I shoved a cracker at Eric, and he pulverized it on the tray. I whispered, "Why me?" under my breath. Our meal came, and the nuisance continued. Now the bum was shouting from across the room, "Do you know patty cake? Attaboy, you know peekaboo? Hey, look, he knows peekaboo." Nobody thought it was cute. The drunk guy was probably a drunk and definitely a disturbance, and I was embarrassed. My husband, Dennis, was humiliated. We ate in silence, except Eric, who was running through his repertoire for the admiring applause of a Skid Row bum. Finally, I had enough. I turned the high chair. Eric screamed and clamored to face his old buddy. Now I was really mad. Dennis went to pay the check and implored me to get Eric and meet me in the parking lot. I trundled Eric out of the high chair and looked towards the exit. The old man sat poised and waiting, his chair directly between me and the door. Lord, just let me out of here before he speaks to me or Eric. I headed to the door. It soon became apparent that both the Lord and Eric had other plans. As I drew closer to the man, I turned my back, walking to sidestep him and any air he might be breathing. And as I did, Eric, all the while with his eyes riveted to his best friend, leaned far over my arm, reaching with both arms in a baby pick-me-up position. In a split second of balancing my baby and turning to counter his weight, I came eye to eye with the old man. Eric was lunging for him, arms spread wide. The bum's eyes both asked and implored, "Would you let me hold your baby?" There was no need for me to answer, since Eric propelled himself from my arms to the man's. Suddenly, a very old man and a very young baby were involved in a love relationship. Eric laid his tiny head on the man's ragged shoulder. The man's eyes closed, and I saw tears hover beneath his lashes. His aged hands, full of grime and pain and hard labor, gently, so gently, cradled my baby's bottom and stroked his back. I stood awestruck. The old man rocked and cradled Eric in his arms for a moment, and then his eyes opened and set squarely on mine. He said in a firm, commanding voice, "You take care of this baby." Somehow I managed "I will" from a throat that contained a stone. He pried Eric from his chest unwillingly, longingly, as though he was in pain. I held my arms open to receive my baby, and again the gentleman addressed me. "God bless you, ma'am. You've given me my Christmas gift." I said nothing more than a muttered thanks. With Eric back in my arms, I ran for the car. Dennis wondered why I was crying and holding Eric so tightly, and why I was saying, my God, forgive me, forgive me." I remember listening to that in church, and I was sitting next to somebody that had a disability, and I was crying, and they were crying, but he whispered that was me, and I knew which one he was. And I think maybe we've all been in some time in both not seeing who's there and not being seen. This path of mindfulness and compassion wakes us up out of that with those closest to us. And it's really the hope of our society that we can slow down enough and really look and see who's there. Then we can respond with an open heart. So let's practice for a few moments. Feel like, well, to move around if you need to a little bit, and then sitting in a position where you can let your attention go inward. So as you begin, you might close your eyes and invite yourself to arrive right here, fresh. You might feel your body sitting here breathing. You might for a moment take a few more long and full breaths. And again, bringing to mind some situation in your life with another person where you can sense the barrier, that there's some separation, there's some blaming or resentment or judgment. A relationship where you'd like to explore having more awareness and space and kindness. And let yourself go as if you're watching a movie of the relationship to the frame that most expresses the conflict, or what causes the conflict, where it's most difficult. Then you might have an image of the person's face or what they're doing, maybe hearing their voice and what they're saying. And let yourself be aware of the kind of feelings that come up, what triggers the blame or anger. You begin by just recognizing that really cleanly. It's like that question, so what is happening inside me? And that's the question for recognition. Okay, blame, anger, whatever you notice. And the A of rain is to allow it. It's like not to add on that judgment that this shouldn't be happening or I should do something about it. Just let it be. Allow. That creates some space for something new and different. And the I is to go inside more. With the I, you're asking, well, what's really happening inside me? And you might sense the feelings that are the strongest. Maybe there's a belief going on about how that person's thinking about you or what they believe about you, what it means, the way that they're acting that way. That they don't value you or respect you. And if that belief's there, then let yourself go more fully into the body, what it's like when you're feeling, and maybe sense your throat, your chest, your belly, when you're really feeling the reaction. You might let your face take the expression that most shows when you're caught in the blame or the hurt. As part of investigating, you might wonder what from the past is familiar about this. Not to analyze, but just to sense kind of the link. It's never one person. It's a patterning. Then you might ask yourself that important question of, where does it most hurt? Where are you feeling most vulnerable? I find as I'm asking these questions, if I put my hand on my heart, it actually helps connect me more, I listen more deeply. So you might experiment right now, and if you've never done it before, just let it be an experiment. Sensing the vulnerable place inside, and asking, well, what does this part most need right now? What's the quality of care that would be most helpful? And listen inwardly. Sometimes the vulnerability in us needs that we let it be okay that it's there. And sometimes we need some message of kindness. Sometimes just the touch. You might vary the touch and so that it actually conveys tenderness. This is nurture. You might call on your most awake heart. Sometimes people think of it as their future self. It's what's already here, but who you're evolving into. And let that awakened heart offer care inwardly. Sense if there's some words that you can send to yourself, some kindness. Notice what happens as you're the holder and the held, when you're offering kindness and feeling that vulnerability. Sense your own experience of your own being, noticing whatever shift might be here. As you begin to bring to mind this other person, you might notice what your deepest intention is. How do you want to be relating to this person? What's your deepest intention? And from that place of the awake heart, from that intention, begin to let that person come into closer view. Just to recognize and allow what that person is going through. And to investigate with that beautiful question, where does it hurt? Can you see how that person might have their leg in a trap? How that person might be afraid and insecure, feel hurt, feel threatened, have unmet needs that are playing out. Where does it hurt? And then the nurturing for that other person is to include that person in your heart. One of the great non-dual teachers said that, really our freedom is when we don't exclude anyone from our heart. So sense that you could send some message of nurturing, of forgiveness, of kindness to that person. And if that doesn't fit right now, and it might not, just to sense your intention, because the intention opens the door. Noticing who are you when your heart is beginning to include another. And take some moments in quiet just to sense whatever message from your own awakened heart is most here for you, whatever reminder or learning or takeaway. What do you want to remember? As you're ready, take a few full breaths and open your eyes. Welcome back. So first I want to honor you and thank you, because you never know what kind of guided practice you're going to get. And this is not an easy one. I'm glad it's at the end of these couple of days, because it takes a certain amount of willingness and presence. I'd like to invite you to do is turn to somebody, your right or your left, so that we're in pairs or else threes if that is what turns out to be workable. So nobody's without a partner. And just take a few minutes to share whatever message or takeaway or challenge you had in this process of healing and forgiving. Okay? So just turning to your partners, and we're going to take about 3 or 4 minutes to do that. Thank you. So I think of this practice that we're talking on a kind of personal, individual level, really as the hope for peace on earth. That if we can have the mindfulness to be aware of what's going on inside of us, and kind, and begin to include others in our hearts. The Dalai Lama put it this way, that if all the children, all 8-year-olds in the world could be taught mindfulness, next generation there would be no more war. This is the hope. In Rwanda, at the Genocide Memorial Center, there's an inscription on a plaque, and it says, "If you knew me and really knew yourself, you would not have killed me." So it's a path of healing. We're talking about a path of healing here, that we can create the world we believe in. We can do that. So there's one writer describes this kind of willingness of the heart in this way. He says, one time a man left home. He had argued with his parents, and they had horrible words, and he left without saying goodbye. He was gone many years. He even spent time in jail. Years later, he got out of jail and wondered if they were even alive, and if they were ashamed of him, and if the conflict was still inside them. So he wrote to them and said he was going to be home on a specific day, and if they wanted to see him, and we're not ashamed, we're willing to be with him, just to put a blanket on the clothesline, and he'd know to come inside. And he said if the blanket was missing, he'd know that he wasn't welcome. So he arrives by rail that next week. He's really nervous when he steps off the train. There's no one there to meet him. He walks the worn path towards home, thinks about the past. He thought about the time in jail, how ashamed his parents must have been. He thinks about all the horrible words they spoke to each other, and he's just about to turn back when he comes upon a blanket in a tree. He keeps walking, and he sees another blanket. Then he turns towards home, and the house is covered with blankets. The yard is covered in blankets. The clothesline was covered in blankets. The path to the door is covered in blankets. His parents were standing there, and they were welcoming him inside. I feel like this is what's possible, that we can put blankets out for ourselves when we've tightened up and gone to war with ourselves, and for each other. So a closing prayer, okay, if you just take a moment. This is Diane Ackerman. It's a school prayer, actually. In the name of daybreak and the eyelids of morning, and the wayfaring moon and the night when it departs, I swear I will not dishonor my soul with hatred, but offer myself humbly as a guardian of nature, as a healer of misery, as a messenger of wonder, as an architect of peace. In the name of the sun and its mirrors and the day that embraces it, the uttermost night and the male and female and the plants bursting with seed and the crowning seasons of the firefly and the apple, I will honor all life, wherever and in whatever form it may dwell, on earth my home, and in the mansions of the stars. Thank you for your attention. Many blessings.